So again, hello and welcome to this linear webinar, the last webinar for 2020. My name is Anna Maria Boller, and I'm the linear principal investigator and deputy director of the Gender Violence and Health Center here at LSHDM. Before I start with the presentation, please note that we are recording this session. A little bit of information and background on the linear project for those of you that are not familiar with it. Linear stands for the Learning Initiative on Norms, Exploitation and Abuse. And the project sits within the Gender Violence and Health Center at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Linear is an international and multi-pronged project looking at how social norms theory can be used to prevent the sexual exploitation and abuse of children and adolescents globally. I think despite the challenges of this year, we have had some really nice successes in linear this year. We had a very interesting biannual meeting, and the fact that a lot of people are using or attending sessions online meant that the webinars have drawn larger audiences than usual. And so for that, we are really appreciative of your interest and participation. Thank you. And you can find all of the previous linear webinars on the linear YouTube channel. And we have included our Twitter handle and webpage on this slide, as you can see. So we encourage you to join the network mailing list if you haven't already done so. And you can learn more about the future webinars and other linear updates via our website. We're really looking forward to our webinar today, which is entitled Quantitative Proxies for Social Norms, Interrogating, Clustering, Reference Groups, and Validity. Today, our presenter is Ilana Seff. Ilana is a staff scientist at Brown School, Washington University in St. Louis, and she's also just about to complete her DRPH in Population and Family Health from the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health. Congratulations for that, Ilana. And she's presented her work today on techniques researchers can use to aggregate measures of attitudes or behaviors to serve as a proxy measure for descriptive or injunctive norms. Her work hasn't been published yet, so at this stage we can't share a recording of the webinar or the slides. But if you have any questions after the webinar, please get in touch with us at Linear and we can forward your questions to Ilana. Our contact details are on the slides, as you can see as well. The presentation will last about 35 to 40 minutes, and we will leave time for Q&A at the end. So please use the Q&A box to enter your questions during the presentation. If I will be curating the questions, if I see that there's any question that needs an immediate clarification, I will pose it to Ilana and we can pause. But if not, I'll leave them until the end. And I will read them to Ilana for you at the end because we are on the webinar format. If you have any technical issues, please type your question as well in the chat box. And Lottie, who is supporting the webinar behind the scenes, will help you. So without much further ado, over to Ilana.
Thanks, Anna Maria, and thank you to the Linnea Network for having me here. I'm really excited to present my work, and as Anna Maria mentioned, I will be defending my dissertation next week. So this is part of that body of work, and so it's I'm glad to be getting a chance to present beforehand. So my presentation today is on the quantitative proxies for social norms, interrogating, clustering, reference groups, and validity. Next. So I know you are all familiar with social norms. It's probably why you're here. But I thought I would just give a quick introduction first, particularly as social norms relate to intimate partner violence, or IPV. So as I'm sure you all know, IPV is highly linked to gender and social norms, specifically those that promote dominant or aggressive conceptions of masculinity, norms that promote patriarchal decision-making, and those that condone violence as an acceptable conflict resolution mechanism. Next. There are two types of social norms. There are descriptive norms, which relate to what you think others in your community or others in a group that you consider yourself to be a member of, what those people do. So for example, a descriptive norm related to IPV might sound like all the men in my community beat their wives when their wives burn the food. Next, there are also injunctive norms, and those relate to what you think others in your group expect you to do. So this relates more to perceived sanctions and rewards for your behavior. So for example, someone might think, well, my neighbors won't think I'm a man if I don't punish my wife, or my neighbors expect me to tolerate my husband's abuse to keep my family together. And then next, lastly, there are attitudes, which are importantly distinct from norms. They are certainly related, but they are distinct. And that is your own personal belief about a given behavior. So this might look something like, I think it is okay for me to hit my wife if she talks back to me. Next. And then lastly, there are reference groups. And this is really important to social norms as well as to my presentation today. So this is a group of people for which mutual expectations hold about behavior. So when I'm thinking about what kinds of behaviors I'm going to do, especially related to IPV, who am I thinking about when I think about, well, what will they think if I do this? Or everyone else does this, so it's okay if I do it. Who is that group of people that you're thinking about when you are letting them influence your behavior? Next. So measuring social norms can be difficult. Even just sometimes explaining them can be difficult. You have to get people to think about what others think or do, which is really a lot of complex dynamics. You have to get people to think through to answer questions on social norms. That's easier to do with qualitative methods. You can sort of take your time, you can present vignettes and ask people to respond how, what they would do, what they think, how they think others would react. But it's a lot harder to do with quantitative data. It's difficult, in a survey structure to sort of quickly answer those types of questions. And it's also easier to answer those types of questions if an attitude or behavior is really salient within a reference group, because then you're much more aware of it. And so it's more at the forefront of your mind. It's easier for you to sort of pick up on that norm and answer those types of questions. Next. So a growing number of studies have tried to include or develop quantitative scales of direct norms. So they make scales that ask, what share of your reference group does this, et cetera. And you may have seen some of these at the Linnea conference a couple months ago, but they're still new. They're not as widespread. And so there really have been calls to develop better methods to quantitatively measure norms, and particularly to sort of leverage or build on existing data sets that have quantitative data you might be able to use to measure norms, but don't have these sort of direct measures of social norms. So in fact, the Lancet's series on gender equality, norms, and health, which came out last year, in the initial conception of that series, there was a call for the development of more ways to leverage existing quantitative data to get at social norms. Next. So while there are not a significant number of data sets with variables on norms, there are a lot of large quantitative data sets with information on IPV behaviors and attitudes. So a lot of these you're already familiar with: the DHS, the Violence Against Children surveys, Permundo's images survey, the multiple indicator cluster survey. All of these are really robust, often nationally representative or even representative at smaller geographical levels. They contain a wide range of data, including information on attitudes and behaviors towards IPV. And there's a growing number of studies that will aggregate a measure of attitudes at some group level, and then they'll call that group level measure a proxy for social norms in that group. So let me explain a bit more what I mean next. So imagine that you have a data set of women. Let's say this is a DHS data set. These are individuals. And the data set includes information on education level, socioeconomic status, attitudes towards IPV, and IPV victimization in the last year. And you want to create some you want to look at how all of these covariates affect IPV victimization, but you also want to include something in your model around norms in the community. Next. So what you might do is, suppose these are communities, you would look within each community, and at the community level, you would aggregate these attitudes. So let's suppose these are, each dot is an attitude of a woman towards IPV. You would take some aggregate measure at the community level next. And this could be a variety of things. Studies do this in different ways. It could be the percentage of women in the community that think IPV is acceptable. It could be the average score on an IPV attitude scale. And you'll take some measure at the community level, and you'll create these community level measures and call that the norm in that community. And you might include this in a multi-level model and have this, look to see how do the norms in the community affect IPV victimization. Next. Sorry. So for example, you might examine a couple relationships. So a recent study used student level data to create a classroom level score of teen dating violence. And then they looked at a student's likelihood of experiencing or perpetrating violence based on the norms in his or her classroom. So again, the measure of the norm is not a measure in the traditional sense. They didn't ask students, do you think others in your classroom perpetrate violence? But they created this proxy around the norm in the classroom. Or other studies, and this is pretty common actually, will look at either the percent of women in the village, as I said, who agree IPV is acceptable, and look how that influences a woman's risk of IPV at the individual level. And again, they'll call this percent of women in the village who agree IPV is acceptable the norm in that village. Next. Keep forgetting I have to also press next on my computer. So again, just to reiterate, they might, this has become sort of an increasingly common approach, and researchers might use these norm proxies to answer various research questions. So how do community level norms around IPV acceptance relate to a woman's victimization, to a man's perpetration, to an individual's attitudes towards IPV? And again, each group level norm is created using an individual level attitude or behavior. Next, a couple times again, one more time. Thank you. So again, this is really an increasingly popular approach. This is sort of the landscape, the background for thinking about my research. And so for the first step, I wanted to ask, what are the current approaches used to generate norm proxies around IPV, and what are the gaps and best practices in these methodologies? Next. So to answer this question, I conducted first a systematic review of peer-reviewed literature published since 2000. The study had to either examine a norm proxy related to gender or IPV, or it needed to analyze the relationship between a norm proxy and then perpetration of experiences of or attitudes towards IPV. Given the focus on proxies in quantitative data, I did not include any studies that use qual methods only, nor did I include any studies that use these illicit direct measures of social norms. And so after all the stages of review, I had 26 studies. Next. And so once I had all of these studies for the analysis, so first, after reading through all of the studies, I pulled descriptive stats for each study. And so that included the setting, the reference group population, so whose data did they use to create the norm proxy, as well as the outcome population, and those can be different. So as I mentioned before, I could use men's attitudes within a community as the norm around IPV in that community, but I could be looking to see how that affects women's IPV victimization. So those two populations can be different. I looked at the content of the norm proxy. So were they using attitudinal variables? Were those around IPV, around gender inequity? Were they using behavioral variables? and then the findings. However, when it came to looking more at quality, there are no standards for assessing the quality of these approaches yet. So as a first step toward being able to develop these types of criteria, I wanted to try to understand the landscape of existing approaches and to try to identify any implicit standards that seem to be there that might then be extracted and made explicit components of assessing quality for these types of studies. So in selecting these methodological characteristics that I wanted to look at, I wanted to prioritize a few things. So one, the construct validity of the measure. And what I mean when I say that is whether the underlying individual variable is actually clustered within the analytical groups selected, and so is potentially under normative influence within those groups. And I'll explain more about that later. I also wanted to look to see what was done around the representativeness of the within and across group measures, as well as conclusions drawn about causation. Next. So I selected 4 key characteristics that I looked at. The first was the number and the size of the groups. So in terms of the number of groups, I wanted to make sure that the sample size of groups was large enough that we could detect variation across groups. So if you can imagine, if you have 20 communities and they all have an IPV acceptance score of 7 out of 10, then it's really hard to understand how IPV attitudes at the community level influence victimization, let's say, because you just don't have any variation to exploit. I also wanted to make sure that there were enough units per group. So if you have 20 communities, but you only have 2 observations per group, you're not going to be very confident that your group level norm proxy is representative of that group. I also wanted to look at what the studies did around reference group considerations. So, a lot of times you're limited to what groups are available in the data, but was there any reflection on that? Any noting that this could be a limitation, perhaps the groups you use are not the appropriate group for the given behavior or attitude. I wanted to look at an assessment of clustering or variance within and across groups. And I will elaborate on that a bit more, but essentially if you have a group and everyone in the group sort of holds a different attitude about intimate partner violence, and they're not really influenced by each other, it's sort of just your own attitude, then averaging the attitudes in that group, that's a great group level measure, but is it a great group level norm measure? Are those attitudes really under normative influence, or is it sort of a false assumption to assume that? And so I wanted to look to see, are these attitudes or behaviors used to make the norm proxy, are they clustered? And then finally, I wanted to look at any consideration or noting limitations around causality. So suppose you have a study that finds that men who believe the majority of men in their peer group perpetrate IPV, and they are then themselves more likely to perpetrate IPV. So social norms theorists would argue that my behavior is influenced by my peers' behavior. So I'm sort of convinced either implicitly or explicitly to perpetrate IPV because that's what those in my friend group do. However, the relationship could go in the other direction. So it could be that men who have perpetrated IPV are more likely to believe that this is a common behavior and that, to avoid cognitive dissonance. And so they are then more likely to report that their friends also perpetrate IPV. Or alternatively, it could be that men who perpetrate IPV are more likely to seek out friends who also perpetrate IPV. So these are things to consider when you conduct this kind of analysis, and I wanted to make sure there was reflection on that. Next. So as I mentioned, there were 26 studies that turned up after the final review. 24 of those used an attitudinal measure for the proxy rather than a behavioral measure. And 15 of those, so more than half, use the standard 5 scenarios on attitudinal acceptance of IPV, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. They'll say, is it acceptable for a husband to beat his wife in the following scenarios? And then they will, it includes if a woman neglects the children, if she burns the food, if she goes out without asking, etc. And then importantly, 13 studies, so half, used attitudinal data from women only. And that will become relevant later on. Next. So for the first characteristic, so for the number and size of groups, many studies provided the overall sample size and the number of groups. So I could calculate the average number of individuals per group, but the study didn't actually specify any rules for the number of individuals per group. However, 72 and 16% of studies respectively had either above or below 10 individuals per group. So there definitely was a trend, either by default or intentionally, to prioritize larger groups, but only 6 studies actually removed groups with fewer than a certain number of observations, which I have sort of deemed the best practice in terms of this methodology. So if they were including the group level measure in a model, if that group measure was derived from fewer than, let's say, 10 or 8 individuals, they excluded those individuals from the model. They just didn't feel that it was representative enough of that group. Next. So for the reference group consideration, so half of the studies did not discuss reference group consideration at all. Typically they used primary sampling units or communities for the group. And this is, likely just that is what was built into the existing data structure. But it should still be listed as a limitation. Again, thinking about the example I gave where you construct a group level average from attitudes that are all over the place, that's not necessarily the right reference group then. 7 studies did acknowledge the potential limitation of the reference group they used, but only 5 studies assessed the relative influence of the proxy measure for multiple sets of reference groups. So for example, they looked to see how the norms among young men influenced a woman's likelihood of victimization, but also how the norms of older men influence the likelihood of victimization. And they looked to see where the correlation was stronger. Next. Next 3 times, sorry, thanks. So one study I just wanted to highlight, they actually provide a justification of the group they used to construct the norm proxy. So they used peer network camp levels, and they actually provided a definition of this. So it's social networks of mostly male members with an elected leadership structure, and they meet regularly in fixed locations. And what was neat about this study is they also had respondents answer some questions on their perception of their peer network social cohesion. And they found that the normative effect of attitudes in their peer network that effect was stronger on their own behavior when the respondents perceived greater social cohesion in their group. So that was another great way to sort of be more confident that the reference group they selected was appropriate. Next. Okay, so in terms of variance and clustering, so 14 studies did not assess variance and clustering of the norm proxy across or within groups at all. So again, that means that if they had 20 communities and the average acceptance in each community was 7, that could mean 2 things. It could mean that every single person in the community held something close to a 7, in which case it would be very clustered within each community, and that would be a good proxy for something normative. Or it could be that in the community, the attitudes were all over the place, but the average was 7. Again, that's still a community level average, but it's not really a good community level norm proxy. 8 studies at least examined the range of measures across groups. So as before when I was talking about, you want enough variance across groups so that it's useful to include in your model. You can see how different levels of group norms affect the outcome. And then one study used the intraclass correlation coefficient, or the ICC, to assess across group variation or within group clustering in the norm proxy. Next. So before I go on, let me just quickly explain the intraclass correlation coefficient. So the ICC is an inferential statistic, and it provides information about how much units within groups resemble each other as compared to across groups. So it assumes a value from 0 to 1. 1 or a higher value means units within groups tend to look more similar, so they're more clustered. Next. So a couple of examples. So suppose you're looking at religion across communities in Nigeria. In this case, you would expect that religion tends to be clustered within communities. So a community tends to be mostly one religion or another. In that case, the ICC would be much higher. Next. Alternatively, let's say you're looking at gender across communities in Nigeria. So in this case, there's really no reason to expect that communities would be mostly female or mostly male. You would expect sort of an even distribution within and across communities. And so in that case, the ICC would be really close to 0. Next. So as you can see here, this is sort of an illustration of this. You can imagine that in the box on the left, let's say, again, these are attitudes towards IPV. Here, the ICC for the attitudes would be a lot closer to 1 because they are clustered within these groups. And you can see also that if I took a group level average or some group level measure of these attitudes, I would also be really confident that this is normative within those groups. On the right, the ICC would be closer to 0. There doesn't seem to be any clustering within groups. And so taking a group level average of these attitudes wouldn't be a great proxy for norms to include in the model. Next. So as I mentioned, one study used this ICC to sort of confirm that there was clustering of this norm proxy variable. Next. So only one study did this for the actual norm proxy. 6 studies did it for the outcome. So they at least confirm that what they are interested in at the end, the outcome, either victimization or perpetration of IPV, was clustered, but they didn't do it for the norm proxy. And next. And then one thing just to note is that there was no threshold identified where an ICC was lower. So there's no value where if an ICC is lower than that value, that kind of definitively suggests there's no clustering or normative influence. So studies would report the ICC, but they didn't necessarily reflect on what that meant. Next. And so finally, in terms of causality, so 7 studies did not mention any limitations or assumptions that they were making to claim causation. 8 studies mentioned the cross-sectional nature of the data as a limitation. And then 10 studies did elaborate on alternative explanations for the association. So for example, the higher community level violence could lead to more accepting attitudes of IPV at the community level. So they acknowledge that it could be that the direction goes in the relationship goes in the other direction. Next. So, despite the fact that this approach is not uncommon, it was apparent that there's really a lack of consistency in how these measures are constructed and interrogated. And when I say interrogated, I mean, was there any exploration of the data to see if the norm proxy is a valid representation of something that is under normative influence? And so coming away from this study, I really thought about what researchers should be asking when they use a norm proxy and what are the steps they can take to answer those questions next. And so I came up with the following 4 questions and the corresponding steps. And the rest of my presentation is going to be focused on the next two. So checking, is the norm proxy clustered within groups? And is there a more appropriate or valid configuration of groups with which to construct the norm proxy? And a few steps for each. So for the next step, I really wanted to demonstrate how one could follow these steps with their data before including a norm proxy in their analysis. Next. One more time. So to demonstrate this, I used images data from Tanzania. This is a data set put out by Promundo. I used data from 2016. It had 2,000 individuals, half men, half women. And the reason this was such a great data set for this question is because the data not only includes questions on attitudes and behaviors around IPV, but it's one of those unique data sets that actually also includes direct, descriptive, and injunctive norms questions. And it also includes various variables I could use to test out different group level aggregates. So I can look at villages, but I can also look at ethnicity. I can look at combinations of those combined with sex or with age, different potential, based on the literature, different potential groups that might be appropriate fits for the norm proxy. So I created an attitude score that included 6 items on IPV and male control in a relationship. The score could be 1 to 6, where higher is more accepting of IPV and male control in a relationship. And then I created corresponding scales for descriptive and injunctive norms. So you can see here from this table that each attitude was matched directly to a descriptive and injunctive norm. So if the attitude was, I believe that a woman should tolerate violence to keep her family together, the corresponding descriptive norm was, women in my community tolerate violence to keep their family together. And the injunctive norm was, most people in my community think women should tolerate violence to keep their families together. Next. So if I was conducting a study like one of the 26 that I included, probably my next step would be I would aggregate the attitudinal score at the village level, because that was sort of the natural, like, community level measure.
10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. That was sort of the average community level measure that, would make sense to construct a norm proxy. And that assumes that the village is the best configuration for the norm proxy. Instead, what I did as a first step is I calculated the ICC for multiple potential group configurations. So not just for villages, but also men's attitudes only in villages, women's attitudes only in villages, ethnicity and sex, age and sex, etc. So groups based off of those characteristics. And then I calculated the ICC for the attitude measure across those groups. And I'm trying to answer the question, how clustered are the attitudes for these different group configurations? Next. So as you can see here, I calculated the ICC for all of these different group configurations. Next. And what I found was that the ICC was highest for men's attitudes within villages, and also men's attitudes based on their village and their marital status. And so that means that the attitudes tend to be the most clustered for those groups. So if I was, going about this analysis, so far those two groupings are actually my top contenders for including as the reference groups for the norm proxy to include in my model. One thing that's interesting to note here is that you can see that the groups that include women's attitudes only are actually always lower than the groups that include men's attitudes only. So it does seem that men's attitudes tend to be more clustered across these groups than women, which is important because, as I mentioned earlier, half of the studies from my systematic review only used women's attitudes. And that is typically because men's attitudes are not as frequently included in these types of surveys. Next. So then I wanted to look at the group size and number. So of these two top contenders, looking at males' attitudes in villages, I can see that I have 56 groups and I have an average of 18 observations per group, but that's also the minimum. Whereas for villages and marital status for males only, I have 112 groups, but the average number of individuals per group is 9 and the minimum is 2. So that means that if I was going to include this in a model, I would probably want to exclude several of the groups from my model because I'm not really confident that my sample size is large enough. So based on this, if this was the study I was doing next, I would select men within the same village as my norm proxy group to include in the model. So those are sort of the steps you would take. Because this data set next has actual norms questions, I can go a step further and essentially check my work. So I can look to see if the group level proxies that I've created, if they predict the actual norm scores. So essentially, when a woman answers a question about what she thinks others in her community do or think, who is she actually thinking about? And the same for men. Next. So this is looking at essentially the correlation between these group level measures and what individuals actually think about their community. Next. So I will try to distill all of the information in that table. So interestingly, I find that women's norms questions, actual norms questions as answered by women are not positively associated with the group level aggregates for any of the groups, which was a very interesting finding. So in other words, what a woman thinks others think or do is not positively correlated with what others in any of the group configurations actually think or do. This was not the case for men. So what a man thinks others think or do was highly positively correlated with what others in his community and others within his community and marital status think. So that matches what I had selected for my norm proxy previously. And while it was associated with what women and men think, it was much more strongly associated with what men think. So it suggests that men, at least in this setting, were really sort of keyed into what other men in their village are thinking. And when they are answering norms questions, that is likely who they're thinking about. And then one final nice check was that there was a slightly stronger association with the injunctive norms scale as opposed to the descriptive norms. Again, the injunctive norms is what you think other people expect of you. So that's more related to sort of their attitudes as opposed to their behaviors. So it was nice to see that the group proxies of the norm proxies, which were derived from attitudes, were more strongly associated with injunctive norms. Next. So a few sort of key takeaways and limitations. I think this study really kind of does demonstrate that there's value in sort of following these set of steps that can help you really interrogate your norm proxy and be more confident that when you include it in analysis, it is a valid proxy for a norm. But there is further research needed. So as I mentioned, the ICC can be really useful for comparing relative clustering across different group configurations. But there isn't a threshold identified where, I can say if the ICC is less than this value, I shouldn't consider it as a norm proxy at all. So I think further research needs to be done in that area. It also really highlights the importance of collecting and using data from men. So at least with the images data from Tanzania, the group level proxies that were derived from women's attitudinal data only, they weren't correlated with any of the other actual norms questions. And further, they were not as clustered. So it may be that you get more value, more insight from using these norm proxies with data from men. That would mean there needs to be a prioritization of collecting more data from men as this is not always prioritized. A lot of this data is collected for women. Next. But it really highlights that there should also be more of a focus on understanding appropriate reference groups before program implementation. So before you implement a program, some sort of social norms program around intimate partner violence, you could use existing quantitative data from that setting and sort of use the steps that I've laid out to try to understand where those attitudes are more clustered, and that can help inform how you organize the groups, let's say for discussions or dialogues, et cetera. And I think the findings also really highlight the importance of working with men and boys, of course, in addition to women and girls, to prevent violence, especially for social norms programs. You know, men are the ones perpetrating IPV, and I think especially from the Tanzania data, we can see that they really are picking up on their peers' attitudes around these behaviors. And so they really are great candidates for social norms programming and messaging. Next. And that is all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ilana. And I can see some questions coming. So I'm going to read it to you. From Esther Spindler, wonderful presentation. Some studies use aggregate behavioral measures as a proxy for collective norms. For example, percentage of women using contraception within a particular group of area. Did you consider any of these studies for your review? And could you discuss some of the issues in using these behavioral proxies for collective norms?
Thank you, Esther. That's a great question. So I did consider these. So I didn't consider any of with the content as you're mentioning, because those typically weren't related to IPV, but I did consider studies that use behavioral measures. And so in that case, the sort of proxy was a proxy for descriptive norms. So for what others think others do. While that was a fair game criteria, there were only 2 studies in the 26 that used a behavioral measure. I think that the issues around using behavioral proxies are the same as those around attitudinal proxies. I think it's just a matter of understanding that you are proxying for a descriptive norm and understanding how that might differentially influence your own behavior as compared to thinking about injunctive norms and thinking about someone potentially doing or not doing a behavior because of sanctions or rewards. One thing to note is and I didn't include this in this presentation, but one thing to be careful about is if you are, let's say, looking at the sort of collective norm around contraception use in different groups and how that influences your own, you'll want to make sure to exclude your each individual's contraceptive use from the group level aggregate for them. Otherwise, you will have greater correlation just by the way you constructed that measure.
Thank you, Ilana. Do we have any other questions from our audience? So, well, please feel free to write in the chat box if you have any other questions. I have a couple of questions as well, Ilana, if you allow me. Thank you very much. It's really a fascinating presentation. So I'm not a quantitative statistician, so my question might not be very relevant, but I was thinking 2 things. So how does this ICC compare to other attitudes? Because in absolute terms, none of your ICCs was very high. So if it's 0 to 1, even the high ones were 0.2. And I was wondering, how does that compare to ICCs in other attitudes, in other areas, because that might be interesting per se. And is there any kind of statistical measure or any statistical significant test to compare ICCs? as in other measures of association?
Yeah, so those are both great questions. So that is definitely, something we struggled with, and all of this work originally came out of looking at attitudes for that Lancet series that I mentioned. Using VAX data, we wanted to use these norm proxies within communities to look at how that affected victimization. And we weren't finding that any of those group level proxies were associated with victimization. And so I thought about looking at the ICCs across groups, and we found that actually the attitudes were not clustered at all. So in that case, the ICCs were closer to, let's say, between 0.05 and 0.1.
Mm-hmm.
So then we decided, let's actually look at the ICC for a bunch of different things and try to see if things we know to be clustered have a higher ICC. So while the attitudes were clearly not clustered within communities, things like female genital mutilation were, and those are things that we know to be typically very clustered in communities, especially in some of the countries where we were looking. But even in those cases, the ICC was, I think, maybe 0.4 or 0.5. So it's rare that you're going to have an ICC that's super close to 1. But certainly higher is better. There does, I think, need to be more work done from a statistical side around, again, how can you sort of classify different levels of an ICC in terms of clustering. For your second question, sorry, can you remind me what it was?
No, I was just like, I was really interested in how you decided the differences between the ICCs by looking into the number of observations, and I can see why, but I was wondering if at the statistical level you could directly compare the two measures and see if this is statistically significant different, because they were really close.
Yeah, they were really close. And that is definitely something I could do. And part of my decision was, of course, also informed by the literature and what I know to make more sense in terms of normative influence. And then, of course, certainly I would not have been comfortable. The men's attitudes within villages and the men's attitudes within villages and marital status, the ICCs for that were quite close. And so the only way I was comfortable selecting one of those was by looking at the number of individuals per group. Either would have been fine, but I wanted to prioritize having as many observations as possible, given that the ICCs were so close. I felt that was an appropriate way to make the selection. But in cases where that does not help make the decision, there could be, using a statistical test to compare the ICCs across groups.
Okay, thank you. And Ruchi Latov says, thanks, Ilana, very interesting analysis, but also really appreciating the process you suggest for others to follow, very helpful. So it's basically, congratulations. Any other questions you have for Ilana? I can see that Betsy Bader, sorry. Fantastic presentation, super interesting and useful. In your paper, did you make any recommendations around rules for group size? And do you think there would be any value in interrogating any cluster across villages or at a geographic spread broader than villages?
Great question. So the number I came up with was 10, but so any groups with fewer than 10 observations, I suggest you exclude, just based on some other sort of some other recommendations around statistical sample size and representativeness. But I do think further work could be done to sort of explore the validity of that recommendation. The other question is also a really good one. So in the 26 studies, there were groups sort of wider than villages that were used. So things like wards. I think one study used states. That might have been Nigeria. I can't remember. and those cases, they were certainly limited. So they maybe didn't have as many, maybe they had 13 groups, let's say. But also, and they certainly had enough individuals per group, so that wasn't an issue, but there wasn't necessarily enough variation, or there was sort of too much variation within those groups. So within states, it's sort of conceptually, I think I would be hesitant to include something so large as a norm proxy, because I think I can imagine, certainly just in the States, I'm not thinking about what everyone in my state is doing. So I think, again, that's fine to include as sort of a state level variable, just as sort of a contextual variable to include in your model. But personally, I don't think that's a great proxy for a norm. And those studies did not look at the ICC across those groups. And I think if they did, they would find significant variation within each sort of state or wider geographical group.
Thank you. I cannot see any more questions. I have another question, Ilana, and while we wait for more questions, and this is more sort of looking, and I'm trying to think how to use this information when thinking forward in what data should be collecting to be able to take these decisions and inform the measurement of norms. And I was thinking about the theory of social norms and the importance of influencers and the importance of status. So I didn't see any grouping around, you mentioned religion as an example, but I was wondering, should we be measuring religion? Should we be measuring the position within the community, like leaders? Or, because I think that's another grouping that from the theory is coming as a important one, and we don't always measure that. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So also in some of the original work that we did that helped inform sort of this whole idea, we did look at religion for experiences of violence. And in Nigeria, that was quite clustered. We didn't end up pursuing that route, but I do think religion is definitely an important one to include. Again, I think in some contexts, ethnicity is also an important group to include. It was not, the attitudes were not clustered in the Tanzania setting across ethnic group, but I think they very well might be in others. So I do think collecting, sort of reviewing the literature from your setting, and then trying to collect data on those characteristics as much as possible would be extremely beneficial. A lot of times, if you're just trying to leverage existing data, you're of course limited in what's included in that data. But anytime you have sort of you're designing a study and designing data collection, and you have some of these ideas in mind ahead of time, definitely try to include as many sort of group level variables as you can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me check the chat box. We don't have any more questions. So finally, Dady, great presentation, fascinating topic. I'm curious whether you have you explored this topic in relationship to economic inequality by gender at the community level?
So I have not, but that's certainly something that I do think would be a really interesting research question. I expect certainly in many settings, socioeconomic status at least would be very clustered within communities. But this, again, the sort of steps I've laid out don't necessarily have to just be limited to normative influence. I would, argue that economic inequality at the community level wouldn't be under normative influence, but I think it would certainly be interesting to see how that is clustered within and across communities, and you could use these same steps to check that.